The reading this morning is from the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verses 1 to 14. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that what he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get just a little. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "Hey, there's a boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they going to do among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. When Jesus took the loaves and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This indeed, the prophet who has come into the world." The word of the Lord. Letting go of the scarcity mindset for God's vision of abundance. As we begin this morning, I want to remind us that Scripture is far more than just a historic account of Jesus' actions and his miracles. I believe these stories are meant to live in us and to speak to us today and to transform our very reality. You may have heard of the Jewish practice of midrash, the interpretation style that not only engages the words of the text, but behind the text and beyond the text and around the text. And some of you know that I employ that method in my book. So let me offer this morning, by way of exploring this passage, a midrash on this most famous of miracle, the only miracle to occur in all 4 Gospels, so that we might explain and understand some of the deep truths of the story for our own lives today. Philip awakens from a nice nap on the grass, the sound of distant waves and a gentle breeze. What a relief to be away from the crowds as they scurry about planning the Passover celebration. Philip is saddened as he reflects on how the city has grown so crowded in recent years, with increasing numbers of families displaced by Roman land confiscation. He shakes his head sadly. The historic flight from Egypt is on everyone's minds right now. If ever there was a moment for God to intervene, they are saying, it is now. Philip sighs and says to himself, Jerusalem is a powder keg. He sits up and breathes in the fresh sea air and then sits up to gaze at the Sea of Galilee. The mountain provides such a great view of the surrounding countryside. He rubs his eyes, eager to gaze into the distance. What on earth? He stands up to get a better look, and the disciples come running. And there by the sea are hordes of people trudging up toward the mountainside. The front line is minutes away. So much for rest. They would soon be overrun. How will they feed all of these people? It had to be in the thousands. He sees some carrying people on stretchers, hoping to heal loved ones. What if the crowd grows unruly? Jesus stands in front of them, watching the crowd, calm and thoughtful. He turns and smiles. Think you can rustle up some food for these folks? Philip feels his face grow hot. You've got to be joking, Jesus. It would cost half a year's wages just to feed them all. Suddenly, Peter's brother Andrew comes running up the hill with a boy alongside, keeping pace while carrying a basket. I found this boy. He has 2 fish and some Passover bread. Philip frowns. Andrew is always a bit out to lunch. What are they going to do with that? Jesus smiles and thanks the boy. He turns to the disciples and instructs them to have the crowd sit down on the grass in small groups. They gather slowly and settle down. Then Jesus comes to the top of the hill, holds up the basket, and begins to give thanks. The crowd grows quiet, mesmerized by his words and the smiling boy beside him. The boy then takes the basket and gives it to the first cluster of people. He gestures for others to do the same. People pull what they have from their packs and their cloaks. They eat, and warmth and camaraderie spread through the crowd as they share a meal together. Jesus then asks them to collect the leftovers. Leftovers, Philip murmurs. Sure enough, they each collect a basket full of bread, 1 for each of the 12 disciples. Then Philip understands suddenly, manna from heaven, the remaining baskets, proof of God's promised abundance, including a day of rest. The feeding of the multitudes is a story about God's promise of abundance, overcoming scarcity wrought by human tendencies toward fear, anxiety, and greed. Notice the movements we see in this story. From anxiety, how are we going to care for them? To calm, have them sit on the grass. From chaos, we're going to be overrun, to communal sharing. From feeling there's not enough, half a year's wages, to having a surplus, 12 full baskets. From scarcity to abundance. The theme of abundance is introduced from the very first chapter of the Bible. Walter Brueggemann calls Genesis a song of praise for God's generosity. The creation story asserts throughout that it is good, it is good, it is good, it is very good. Be fruitful and multiply. Brueggemann calls it an orgy of fruitfulness, and it ends in the invention of Sabbath, a day of rest. Toward the end of Genesis, a shadow falls over the land of abundance as Pharaoh introduces the principle of scarcity into the world economy. And time and again, we see God asserting the vision of abundance in opposition to the ways of the world. As we unpack the feeding of the 5,000, we'll see how the multiplication of bread connects to the flight from Egypt, the wilderness journey, the miracle of manna from heaven, and the rediscovery of God's abundance. For many of us, God's abundance is hard to tap into. We've been taught the myths of scarcity all of our lives. My father grew up with the story of his own father, who was an orphan, who in turn was an orphan himself. My father's grandfather was an orphan. They never felt like they had enough. And so my father never felt like he was enough, even after he became a prominent lawyer. He once told me he could hear the hoofbeat of the apocalypse, the horses of the apocalypse, bearing down behind him, always. A colleague once told me that his father frequently told him to always look over your shoulder, Bo. No matter how successful you are, there will always be someone coming up behind you to knock you down and take your place. It was then that I realized this was why he had such a hard time collaborating and trusting and letting up. He never felt like he was good enough or safe enough. A close friend of mine told me that whenever she lay on her bed to relax and daydream, her father would find her and say, "Don't be such a lazy bones, Martha. The clock is ticking." He had been inculcated in the Protestant work ethic, an ethic that is less than Christian, according to Genesis. I wonder what animating stories you were taught in your family. Were you taught that you are precious just for being you? Were you taught that you're worthy of love regardless of what you accomplish? Were you heard, seen, and appreciated as you are? Or were you taught to look over your shoulder, to be anxious, to feel you didn't measure up, to overwork, to compete? Our culture drums such fears into us, even if our families do not. We grow up with sayings like laziness is the devil's playground. Those who haven't made it are told they should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, even those who have no bootstraps, and even when the boot is on their neck. European settlers found abundance in this land, but operated out of a sense of fear and scarcity. The Thanksgiving story that we celebrate, the story of sharing and having enough, is far from what white settlers actually did. The story of brutality, theft, labor exploitation is written in all of our DNA, whatever side of the food chain we were on in that struggle, and that generational trauma runs deep. So how then can we come out of scarcity thinking to live God's plan for abundance in all of our lives? Jesus and the movements in this story show us some of the ways we can do that. The first movement in this story is Jesus' expression of gratitude, an ancient spiritual practice in all faiths. During the COVID pandemic, Ross Gay published the Book of Delights. Some of you may have heard it on NPR or read parts of it. It started when he decided one day for kicks just to write about a delightful day that he had. And after doing that, he thought to himself, this is a great book idea. I'll do it. It'll be easy and I'll make some money. And so he committed himself to the practice of writing essays every single day about the small delights that he found. With it, what he found within a month or two into this project was that the delights were calling to him. Write about me, they said, write about me. The more he wrote about delight, the more that delight called to him, and the more delight he felt in his life. Although his life was not without sorrow, without loss, and without fear, his love and joy increased. Delight, like love, he said, grows when I share it. Gratitude functions by interrupting our anxiety fueled by feelings that we don't have enough. And anxiety, says social scientists, is the most sticky and most contagious of all feelings. It spreads like wildfire. It can easily lead crowds to panic. The Buddhist activist Thich Nhat Hanh, who helped refugees flee Vietnam by boat, said that when the crowded Vietnamese refugee boats were met with storms or pirates, if anyone panicked, all would be lost. But if even just one person on the boat remained calm and centered, that was enough. It showed the way for everyone to survive. We human beings have a negativity bias. It's an evolutionary thing. It keeps us protected, but it also gets us very fixated on threats, and we overlook goodness and beauty. So it needs to be an intentional practice to celebrate goodness. By interrupting anxiety and scarcity, gratitude opens our eyes to possibilities to help us act out of compassion rather than fear. There are very good reasons, of course, to be anxious at times. Certainly this past year and a half have been more than enough reasons to make us anxious. But to be able to get in touch with gratitude, sometimes we actually need to get in touch with our pain first. So I'm not saying here that we should ignore the very real threats to our safety. The Psalms really model this for us. In Psalm 22, which Jesus quoted on the cross, he begins, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Once the psalmist pours out his soul, and I mean really pours it out, he lays it on thick. He lets himself be mad at God. He lets himself say the whole world is falling apart, lays out every concern. And then he says, "But you, O Lord, are not far off. You are my strength. I will declare your name to my people, and in the assembly, I will praise you." He turns to gratitude. You might try writing or praying in that format. I've been working on this in my own life recently, and I have struggled with anxiety over the years. And so I tried this practice the other day while walking through my neighborhood. It was a beautiful evening. I was having a lovely walk, but I grew sad because as I watched the warm lights from inside the homes, I thought about how life events prevented me from purchasing a home and settling down long-term with a community of neighbors, something I've really, really longed for. I've been in this neighborhood for 2 years. So I settled into these feelings and I held them with compassion and I let myself feel them. They're very real and very understandable. But then I tried some gratitude and I realized that while I may not own a home, I now live around friends who have offered me incredible hospitality such that I feel an abundance of love and joy, and I get to enjoy a number of gardens that while I don't get to create my own, I don't have to maintain a garden. Note how gratitude fosters sharing. The boys sharing, all sharing is contagious, just as anxiety is contagious. Abundance begets abundance. Scarcity breeds scarcity. So when we give thanks for what we have, we realize that what we have all belongs to God. It puts things in perspective. We're thanking God who made heaven and earth and the fullness thereof. And this helps us recognize that all that we have belongs to God and is meant to be shared, not hoarded. We seek to be more like God, giving as God gives, confident that God provides. The 12 baskets of remaining bread at the end of the story point back to God's provision of manna in the wilderness. Notice that the disciples have come out into the wilderness. This whole story takes place in the wilderness. They're standing on a mountain, just as Moses stood on a mountain to receive the law and God's word. And now they're receiving manna in a parallel story. And you might recall that in that original story of manna in the wilderness, that God instructed the Hebrew people to take no more than they needed. True to form, some tried to hoard the manna, only to find it rotted and maggot infested in the morning. Hopefully that taught a good lesson. But the 12 baskets also, the 12 baskets remind us that hoarding leads to misery for ourselves because it harms our community and it leads to greed and to isolation. And in the American consumer economy, it's easy to get caught up feeling that we need more, a kind of keeping up with the Joneses. Many have said that the pandemic has taught them how to live more simply and how simply we can live. And hopefully we can take those lessons with us. Now, the only time a surplus was allowed was on the 6th day of the week in preparation for the Sabbath, that radical day of rest that God provided and even modeled for us. That was the time they could collect extra manna. The leftover bread from Jesus' miraculous feeding reminds us that God made a world such that there is enough for all of us, not only to survive and thrive, but we can do so without excessive work, without the exploitation of labor. In 2016, Tricia Hershey founded the NAP Ministry. That's right, the NAP Ministry. She began her journey into the hidden powers of rest while doing her Master of Divinity at Emory. This was a year of multiple police killings, and 2 of her close relatives had passed away unexpectedly. And then one day, a thief snatched Hershey's backpack containing all of her class notes, her research, and her first sermon, which she was supposed to deliver in 2 days. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. She was bone tired and she almost quit seminary. But then she started taking naps every day and it turned her around. Today, she is known as the Bishop of Naps. She teaches the radical power of rest, particularly for communities traumatized by racism. And today she has nearly 70,000 followers on Twitter alone. This is more than just urging people to nap. She's urging people to honor God's gift of Sabbath as a form of spiritual resistance. She's telling us to look at how we can resist toxic systems that want us to be disconnected, that want us to overwork 80 hours a week, that want us to feel like we're not worthy unless we are producing something. I follow her on Twitter to get regular reminders, some that are encouraging like this. I hope that today you cultivate community around you. I hope you find a soft space to land. Some that are humorous and chiding. Y'all really will debate and argue and play devil's advocate about anything. It must be painful and tiring. I love to hear that on Twitter. And some that challenge from the depths of history. My very close and known ancestors were America's first capital, sharecroppers enslaved on plantations. They taught me how to be subversive, how to resist, how to rest, why I believe in this work. I am built different. They did not belong to the systems, and I don't either. Rest. A few years ago, I was seriously worried about my health. I had insomnia and headaches and fatigue. And so on Sundays, I decided to give myself 2 hours of rest rather than launch into chores right after church. And after miraculously napping, despite my insomnia, after reading and taking 2 hours, lo and behold, the worst of my symptoms disappeared. Today, decades-old proposals for a 4-hour work week are getting some traction. And thanks part to the COVID pandemic. Companies and city governments around the world have piloted this 4-day work week, and they find that employees are actually more productive when they work this way. This is the business angle on it. But I'm also delighted to see a spate of opinion pieces, one sent to me by Pastor Chuck, all the way from Africa, that people are saying that productivity is not the only reason to shorten our work week. There is a human value to the concept. More time with family, more time to contribute to our communities. All of these things are intrinsic goods, and we should resist, they say, the capitalistic temptation to assign value only to that which turns a profit. We work less because when we do, our relationships, our spirituality, and our creativity thrive, and we can live more abundantly together. These spiritual pathways I've tried to outline here are so true and powerful that businesses try to capitalize on them as well. We see them captured in books like The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. We see them used by prosperity gospel preachers who teach that these spiritual practices will make us uber wealthy. God's reality of abundance is not meant to enrich us materially. God created us thus to make us rich in spirit and in love. The idea that we are valued based on what we are economically worth or how much we produce is a lie born of tyranny and slavery. It is a mere illusion. God made us enough. God gave us enough. May we take that in today and live out the truth of God's abundance through sharing, through practicing gratitude, and by taking rest. Amen.